So let me just say a couple words of welcome. I'm curious, I'm Ed Seidel, the NCSA director. I'm curious to know how many of you are here for the first time to an NCSA colloquium. Is that Dan? Where have you been? Dan's he's just joined us, so it's fair enough. How many of you are from outside of NCSA? Good. I'm curious because I see some faces here I don't often see, which is great. So I'd like to welcome you here. We have a colloquium series that we started a couple of years ago, and we're trying to make sure we bring in people, not only great speakers from across the country and across the world, but also people from across the campus as well as from within NCSA. So I've tried to make it a real priority to have an event like this that brings people together and gives us perspective on what it is we're doing here, not only at NCSA, but across the campus. And we are working very hard to build up interdisciplinary research and education teams that connect together the staff of NCSA with our cyber infrastructure, with faculty across the campus. And it's a real challenge to do that in any environment. I think that the University of Illinois is one of the best places in the world for this, but there are challenges that abound in this area, and I think there's a long way to go, not only for all universities, but the University of Illinois as well. So Will Barley is a professor in the communications department at the University of Illinois, and Will's also been a faculty fellow here this year, and he's been spending a lot of time studying interdisciplinarity, not only just at NCSA, but as part of his career as a scientist. And another way of putting it would be the science of team science. And so Will is going to give a colloquium today, in effect, on the sort of the bigger picture and also his findings of having really studied how NCSA is operating both historically and I think in the last couple of years. And I think it's going to be instructive for all of us to hear about this. Will is an assistant professor in the Department of Communications. He earned his PhD in 2014 in the Media Technology and Society program at Northwestern University. His main research interests concern how individuals and groups use technology to collaborate across technical and occupational boundaries. So that's like the perfect place. I think NCSA is the perfect place to begin to look at this. He's got a lot of areas of interest in his current research, from looking at cross-boundary collaboration, the work of applied weather science, collectively appropriating new technology, policy implications of new simulation technologies, and so on. So it's really a pleasure to have had him here this year, and I hope we'll have a lot of interactions with Will going forward. And now I'll get to the chase and let Will give us a colloquium. So thanks.
Thanks, Ed. All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for the great introduction, Ed. So as Ed said, I'm here to talk to you about interdisciplinarity and what it really means to do interdisciplinary work. This is kind of the big question for my talk. But before I begin, I really need to thank all the participants, all the people who shared their experiences, participated in our surveys as we went about doing this research, because the goal of ethnographic work is not to represent my ideas, but to gather the honest experiences of the people who are members of an organization. And so I'm always humbled by people's willingness to share their time with me as I do this type of work. And so I wanted to make sure that I thank those participants here. Another thing I need to do is recognize that this work in itself is a collaborative product. It was done in partnership with my research team, who are all sitting here. Stand up, you guys, real quick. Caitlin Childs, Lee Din, and Hallie Workman, all graduate students in the Department of Communication. And also, I need to thank NCSA for the wonderful faculty fellowship, which gave me the resources to do this research. And when I say resources, I don't only mean funds, I mean access, membership, and access to this community of scholarship that has turned out to be such a great place to think about what it means to do interdisciplinarity. Okay, so let's get started. So, interdisciplinarity, buzzword, right? And we see it being used more and more in organizations and in scientific contexts. So here we see covers of 2 National Academies reports, one from the NRC, one from the National Academy of Sciences, calling for the need to have interdisciplinary science as a mechanism to address the grand challenges that face us in today's world, right? This notion that we need to not only be thinking about things from within our disciplinary boundaries, but bringing ideas from multiple disciplines together to address these hard issues like climate change. It's a classic hard problem. And to understand why this is such an appealing thing, I think we should go back a little bit and talk about this guy. So this is Thomas Edison, for those of you guys who don't know the picture. And one of the things I like about the story of Thomas Edison that reveals kind of this notion of interdisciplinarity is that there's a lot of mythology around this guy, who's the paragon in many ways of invention and, as I'll argue, interdisciplinarity. So if you ask most people what Thomas Edison did, the first thing they'll say is, oh, this is the guy who made the light bulb. Right? But there are wonderful histories of Edison and how Edison did his work that reveal that he didn't make the light bulb. In fact, the light bulb itself was the combination of a bunch of inventions that had happened over the century before he got his patent in the late 1870s. The incandescent bulb had been invented 30 years prior. Tesla had shown that you could make light by running a current through a filament in the early 1800s. Right? So what is it that Edison is doing? Right? Edison is not making something completely new, but he's bringing together ideas from diverse places and bringing them together in a way that's applicable. So he didn't invent the light bulb, but he made the first feasible and popularly adopted light bulb. And this is where the kind of innovation is coming from. Innovation is a combination. It's not the creation of something completely new. The second part of the myth about Edison is that he didn't do it alone. And so this is a picture of Edison's Menlo Park laboratory, which you can actually go and walk around in at the Greenfield Village Museum in Detroit, Michigan. And so the most productive time of Edison's life was the decade to decade and a half that he spent in his workshop. And his workshop was full of people. And what the really brilliant thing that Edison did was he got together people who were experts in a bunch of different things and forced them to work together on problems nonstop. Right? He put them in a pretty rural place. He had engineers, scientists, manufacturers, patent lawyers who were constantly working and experimenting on lots of different problems. And it was through this process of exploration and what I'm going to argue is dialogue between these different groups was so important to his ability to come up with hundreds of patents over a period of 10 years. And so this notion of connection is kind of what is driving this push toward interdisciplinarity in organizations and in scientific contexts. And we have research that shows that this is a good idea, right? So we have social scientists, research looking at citations in science that shows that team science is cited twice as much as science done by papers that are published by sole authors, and this is a trend that has been increasing since the 70s. We have work by sociologists like Ron Burt, who look at boundary spanners in organizations, traditional organizations, and show things like people who sit at the boundaries between multiple occupational groups are more capable of coming up with good ideas. So ideas rated by judges as being higher quality than people who are isolated within social networks. And guess what? These folks who are boundary spanners also tend to have higher pay and are more likely to get promoted over periods of time. Okay, so this seems like, hey, this is a cool thing for us to do. Another interesting set of studies done by Lee Fleming and his colleagues look at patents, right? And so they have this crazy data set of 35,000 patents. Yes?
A question about the very first bullet there. So a related point, I saw a talk by somebody at the University of Michigan a couple years ago saying that not only in team science do you get more citations, not only in team science do you get more citations. Okay. Not only in team science you get more citations, but the more diverse the team is, the greater citation you get as well.
That's right.
So there's this idea you intuitively think that having people from diverse backgrounds, and here I mean ethnic and geographic and sort of disciplinary, all measured in different ways. It's not just that they have larger networks of groups that would cite them, but they're actually, when you factor that out, they're still better cited. Do you have anything to comment on that?
Absolutely. So Brian Utzi's done some follow-up work that shows some of that sort of effect as well. So it's not just the size of the team, but the diversity of the team itself has some impact on kind of the citation, right? And they're controlling for self-citations, which is a common kind of question that's done in this, right? So we have this evidence. So back to these patent stuff, sorry. So if you are a broker in this network of patents, which means that you connect people, you have connections to multiple areas of expertise, if you shift one standard deviation from the mean in that, the likelihood of your patent being novel, meaning it's bringing together ideas from places that haven't been connected, increases by about 50%. Right? So we have a preponderance of evidence that's looking at large-scale data that suggests that this notion of connecting areas is at least promising. So the question that we have is, why aren't we all doing it? Right? And this is the flip side of collaboration. And alongside this push within organizations, that's been this kind of counter effort, saying, but collaboration is not easy. right? And it creates all sorts of challenges. This is a cover from the Harvard Business Review earlier this year. I love stuff like this, right? We have evidence that suggests that it's not just as simple as bringing people together, because when we bring people together who have different backgrounds, it creates all sorts of social challenges. So, for instance, we know that when you bring together a mixed team, you have mixed goals. We know that there are language barriers. We may think we're talking about the same when in reality we actually have these underlying differences in understanding of the world. It can create conflict. Because we have different goals about what we want to achieve, we need to negotiate this direction in a manner that we might have a little bit less difficulty with if we were all coming from the same place. And as this all piles on top of each other, we have research that suggests that these interdisciplinary diverse teams have a lot more coordination costs. Research and organization suggests that the notion of collaborative overload, so this pressure to get people to be constantly engaging in these collaborative relationships, has made a situation where workers spend so much of their time engaging in communicative activities, they spend less time doing what they perceive as being their actual work, right? So the painting in the literature is that interdisciplinary, yes, is a potentially high reward enterprise, but it's also high risk and very high effort, okay? And so this is kind of where I start for this project, is saying we have this evidence that this is a great thing for us to be achieving, but we should be mindful of how to do it well. And to really kind of negotiate the tension between these two spaces, we need to understand the work of interdisciplinary. What is it that the people who are doing this successfully are doing that enables them to build these relationships? And so the research is engaging in these two research questions, which is, what are the challenges that researchers face as they seek to construct interdisciplinary relationships? And what strategies have they developed to surmount these challenges as they engage in this work? So I needed a great place to ask these sorts of questions. And I found one, right? So this is, I'm not kidding when I say that a big part of the reason I came to Illinois was because NCSA was here. And I thought the NCSA was such a great place to ask these sorts of questions because it has this 30-year tradition of interdisciplinarity. So some of you might recognize this. This is a drawing from the coloring book that they hand out. And this is an image of the first Cray computer that was built at NCSA in the 80s. John Kogut doing quantum chromodynamics, which I believe is computational particle physics. Yeah? Okay. But we have this long tradition of folks bridging disciplinary boundaries and being innovators, leaders in this area of kind of integrating ideas from multiple disciplines. And this is a trend that has continued for its 30-year history. On top of this, the timing for starting this project was great because the second that we got ramped up in our field work, there was this push in discussion about fostering transdisciplinarity within this organizational context. So there was the announcement of this 2020 plan, and one of the central features of this plan was this need to build transdisciplinary convergence, right? And so this was a topic that was on the fore of people's minds as we were going out and talking to them. So how do we do this research? We used a mixed method approach. I'm trained as an ethnographer, so we did a lot of watching and talking and kind of being on the ground with the people. And we augmented this with a social network survey, which we distributed in December. So we had semi-structured interviews where we talked to people from all over the organization and asked them about what they did as they sought to build these relationships. And the key thing about a semi-structured interview is that you aren't assuming that you know the answers to the questions. You're letting the participant guide the direction of the conversation. This helps you discover things that you wouldn't normally think to ask, right? So we're assuming that they're the experts. Participant observation means that we were members of the community. We attended colloquia. We were parts of events. We were in the building. And this is often very helpful for us to interpret the things that people are saying when we're just talking to them in their offices. And with the social network survey, we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail, but we solicited the people's communication relationships. Who did they work with? Where were they in the organization? What was the perceived distance between their expertise? Okay, so let's get into the findings. So what we saw was actually kind of surprising to me. I expected that we would see some variance in people's experiences and strategies. That we might find some people who were resistant to collaborating or didn't really know how to do it. But pretty much across the board, we found incredibly rich and developed strategies that individuals had to talk about building the work that was necessary to build these relationships. So that was a surprising one. And the other thing that we found that was maybe a little bit less surprising, but surprising too, was this widespread perception that there were barriers in place at multiple levels of analysis that inhibited their ability to not necessarily build interdisciplinary relationships, but to build new relationships in certain places. And so this is kind of what we're going to explore as we get into these data a little bit more. And so to kind of set this up, I want to kind of introduce the first big pattern that we initially saw as we talked to people about interdisciplinarity, was that there were two frames. And when I say a frame, I mean perspective on what it means to build an interdisciplinary relationship that emerged in people's talk. And the first was a frame of what I call connection. And so when people used a connection or a transmission frame, they talked about interdisciplinarity as this process of finding someone who is different from you, finding an opportunity for innovation, and building a connection with them, and doing that as much as possible. Okay? And the really interesting thing was that when people deployed this frame, they tended to say things like this. So people at NCSA work on really specific teams. They just kind of have their heads down. They're focused in one area. A lot of people are doing interesting things, but very often nobody beyond their team or even within it really knows what they're working on. Right? So this is interesting, right? Because this is a really collaborative place, but people are saying, where's the collaboration, right? So, but this isn't all people said. So the second frame that we heard from people is what we're going to call an interaction or dialogic frame, which says that interdisciplinary isn't just about building these connections. It's about mining them through a deep engagement with someone from a different background. It's about having these interactions and finding, not just assuming that we can build this relationship from the start, but engaging in the work necessary to make our different views of the world commensurate. And people said very different things when they deployed this frame. They said things like, folks at NCSA have been doing interdisciplinary work for a long time. If you go talk to a specific group, for example, they may not identify as interdisciplinary researchers, but if you dig, you'll find they do interdisciplinary work all the time. So this tension, we have an organization that is collaborative and not collaborative at the same time, is something we're going to try to explain in our talk today. But let's look at the work. Let's look at what people actually did on the ground, because that's what I said I was going to talk about first, right? What does it mean to actually build an interdisciplinary relationship? Oh, the other thing I wanted to do was kind of mark this with the two kind of myths of Edison, sorry. So if you think about this first definition, it aligns with this first myth, this notion that we need to bridge these different ideas. The second definition really lines on to this idea of the workshop as a space where you're not just bringing together people with different ideas, but you're actually letting them engage in dialogue over a period of time. And it's this process of interaction that produces kind of these innovations. Okay. So what did interdisciplinary work look like? Well, people said stuff like this. So it has a lot to do with listening, seeing the work from their perspective, and then going back into your own shoes and trying to reconcile commonalities. If you just come to a person and say, hey, I have this cool research, don't you want to do it? They might say yes because it's cool. But to get people to put money on the table, to commit time, that's a lot of work. Just saying it's cool isn't enough. They need to know they're getting something out of it. Okay? So we're seeing that it's not just about seeing opportunities for relationship, it's about building a commitment to want to engage in this work. And so people exhibited kind of these strategies that were devoted to not just finding this top one, exploring and brokering, but negotiating a common direction with these folks who had very different perspectives and viewpoints on the world. And so let's dig into kind of what this work looked like, right? Yes, we did see people talking about this need to kind of look around you to find these potential connections. So they'd say things, yeah, we have lots of interactions with potential collaborators. It's very ad hoc, but it's not like we're looking for people particularly, but one connection leads to another, and you kind of steer toward the ones that seem more viable in terms of something useful out of it, right? So we are looking in the community around us for potential connections, but beyond that, what most people talk about in depth was this need to not only find the connection, but to engage in interaction, to find this commonality that we could actually use to get something out of this relationship. And I think a great way to think about why this is necessary is to think about how the simple things that are involved in research, such as our objects of analysis, are often much more complex than we think about them. So there are a lot of folks at NCSA who do things like study galaxies, or write code for specific applications, or do things like study how resilient bridges are in terms of disasters. And one of the things that came up constantly in our discussions was this recurring recognition that these things mean very different things to people from different disciplines. And I love this idea. So let's dive a little bit more into this bridge example. So here is a researcher who was talking about a project they were involved with where they were trying to bring together an interdisciplinary team to assess this notion of resilience from multiple perspectives. And they're talking about how a bridge means different things to different people. So for transportation engineers, a bridge is a transportation facilitator. They're interested in how many lanes it has, how many cars it can travel on it. From a structural engineer's point of view, that doesn't matter. It's about how many spans they have. Vulnerability is how much it's broken. A social scientist thinks it's about whether or not it's economically important, or if it's destroyed, are there equity issues of disconnecting disadvantaged districts, right? So I love quotes like this. because they not only demonstrate the potential value of bringing together people from different disciplines, this idea of integrating all of these different perspectives, but they also reveal all of the, really how hard this is, right? So if I just say, let's work on this bridge, and not realize that you're thinking of a bridge as a completely different thing, this creates all of this potential for misunderstanding in our relationship as we work, right? And so people, the researchers we talked to, recognized this. This is really cool. And they had very codified strategies for dealing with it. And they talked about how when I'm engaging with someone from a different background, I don't just let things fly. I start with an interview. And instead of just talking about things using dry terminology about software requirements, I ask them, what if you're using the software we're developing? How are you going to use it for your research? Can you give me a story? And then, using this interview, I start to make a blueprint step by step. We often find we can use their story as a flowchart of what they will do scientifically. And a number of different researchers exhibited strategies like this, where they recognized that I can't just talk to them from my own perspective, but I need to engage in a very mindful process, a conscious process of trying to figure out how they see the world. And it was through this shared understanding that I could actually go about building this relationship. And this takes time. So the biggest mistake you can make in a project like this is not to set up a regular rhythm of meeting. There's a lot of dead air at first. But after a while, it picks up. You feel your way through the barriers, and you begin to develop a common language. You surprise each other because you end up having studied the same thing in different ways. In a really good collaboration, each side is pushing the other, and you can only do that if you get to know each other, right? So what are we seeing here? So we're looking at this work of interdisciplinarity. What I want to point out is the top one of these is the only one that is the piece of this type of work that involves actually just finding these connections. The majority of the work that people talk about is the work that's going on inside this laboratory, this work of developing and exploring and producing this relationship with this person who is different from yourself. And the big thing about this is that this is all work that's done on top of what we traditionally think of as doing research, right? So repeatedly, people told us, this is not work that I get rewarded for. This is not work that is visible to people in the organization, right? And so this is going to be a theme we're going to draw on as we move into the talk. But let's move back and see if now that we know what it actually looks like to do interdisciplinary work, let's see if we can do something to resolve this tension between how an organization can both be collaborative or both be interdisciplinary and isolated. So one of the themes that we heard over and over again as we talked to folks was quotes like this. So you know it's this project here, this project there, you know it's siloed. It's like continental drifts. The projects were drifting further and further from one another and wanting to be more independent. There are these independent islands that are really doing cool stuff, but it's kind of like they're doing their own thing. So to me, this, as an ethnographer, this is like there's something structural going on here. And wait, we have some network data, which is great data for thinking about organizational structure. So let's take a quick look at some of the things that we saw in our network research. So as I said, we sent out the survey that asked people to list the names of people who they talk to as they go about doing their work. And so what we're seeing here is a distribution of their average of the core network sizes of the participants in the survey. Core network means that this is the number of people who you talk to one or more times per week. This is a pretty common thing that's done in network analysis. The idea being here that these are individuals who you have more than a peripheral relationship with. Yes, Mark? Absolutely. So the difference between researchers versus tech admin is if your title says researcher in it, effectively, was how we made that distinction, right? Research, I should talk about this. Yes, so researchers were folks who, in their official title in the organization, the name of the title says researcher. Management is folks who are in charge of the strategy of the organization as a whole, and technical administrative staff involve a combination of folks who do a lot of different stuff in this organization, and really important stuff. Like making the technology work, or working on a bunch of different projects to help them with specific sorts of problems, okay? And so we see this distribution here. So average was 9.8 alters on a core network. And so one thing we did to try and assess this kind of story of siloness was developed a metric of siloness. And this is simply the proportion of ties in my ego network that are on my team. Okay? So if I only talk to people on a regular basis that are off my team, I get a 0. If I talk to half people on my team, I get a 50%. If I only talk to people on my team, I get 100%. And we looked at this distribution just across our sample. And so this is what the distribution of siloness looks like. It's kind of a messy graph, right? it looks like there might be some sort of bimodal thing going on, and this is really the interesting part to me, is that there seems to be a large proportion of individuals in the organization who have complete siloness, largely, okay? But wait, it gets really interesting when you break it down by occupational category. So this is what happens to the data when you break it down by occupational category. The white here are the researchers. The yellow or oranges in this screen is the technical and administrative staff, and the blue are managers. And so what you see, at least visually here, is that, yes, Barbara?
So the 91 to 100 means the person is totally siloed and only talking to their team.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Yes. So what we see here is that management and technical administrative staff seem to be driving this second mode, and researchers tend to be exhibiting this skew toward silentness. And so this is something we can explore through kind of statistical tests. One thing we see is that researchers reported smaller core networks than folks with other occupational roles in the organization. Statistically significant, so 7.2, but they also exhibited more siloing. So the distribution was a significantly different distribution from folks with these other occupational roles, and a third of the researchers who responded to our survey reported complete siloness, meaning that they reported talking to nobody off their team on a regular basis, on a more than one time per week basis. So this is really interesting, right? The interesting thing about this, too, is if you cut the data a different way. So instead of making a measure of siloness that look at communication on and off team, and you look at people's perceptions of disciplinary distance, so I rated how similar or different my expertise is from the people I talk to, this effect goes away completely. So people are interdisciplinary, but they're also siloed. This is interesting, right? So what is the picture of the organization that this portrays? This portrays that the organization we're studying here is not one big lab, but a constellation of small labs who have weak connections connecting them, right? And there's a lot of interdisciplinarity going on within them. So if you take this dialogic perspective and you look at this organization, it's easy to understand how you would think it was interdisciplinary. Because within these groups, there are interdisciplinary relationships going on. But if your perspective is one of connection among the groups, you're not seeing that connection happening because people aren't interacting off of their teams, or at least as much as they are on their teams. So the next question to ask then is, why is this going on? And this, to me, was another one of these kind of surprising things, right? It was amazing to me how in our discussions with folks at NCSA, they made reference to the past, to an event that happened, or a series of events that happened throughout its history, and we call this the time before. And so people talked a lot about NCSA in the 80s as this place where this thing, Mosaic, this is a plaque that's out front, was developed. And Mosaic is the amazing kind of thing that happened at NCSA in the 80s. And it was this great interdisciplinary product created by Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina. It's great. But what happened was in the early 2000s, the exact timing shifts among the people who tell the story, there was this change where NCSA went from being core funded to being soft funded. Went from having this core line of funding from the NSF to having to this mode of operation where researchers needed to bring in grants to fund the way that they went about doing their research. And the reason that I'm talking about this is because everybody marked this as an important way of explaining how this organizational structure had emerged. And it was in the time following this shift, a number of barriers had emerged that prevented and disincentivized people from actually engaging in relationships across these teams. So the first thing we saw were just structural barriers. So if I'm working on a project grant, the only thing you have to work on is that grant. Mosaic would never have come about in this area because it would have been, why are you guys working on this weird software? We need you working on the grant you're funded to do. You get steered away from that experimental or innovative spirit when you have annual reports to do, right? So this notion of grants come along with accountability to a funding agency. You've got to account for your time, and your time is money. And if I'm spending my time bridging between these projects and relationships, how do I build that? So there are administrative barriers built into this kind of soft funding relationship that we heard people talking about. There are cultural barriers that emerged. So there was this flexibility, but after the shift to independent grants, it created these lines where people's job wasn't to go elsewhere. And it's to go under this PI and have these deliverables. This is what I do. So I don't even know who that person at the coffee pot is. It just evolved. It took 7 years, but suddenly I looked around and I said, who are these people, right? So we have people saying that on top of having these structural barriers, we have this emergence of, I'm not even aware of what else is going on in the building around me. Okay? And then on top of that, we see this notion of resource barriers, right? So I think it all comes down to you're fighting for someone to give me money. and it's scary to share that. If you share a piece of the pie, that piece can go away because you can take all the credit for how delicious that pie piece is, right? So in a soft funding environment where your ability to keep your job, this is something we heard a lot of people say, relies upon you bringing in funds, it's scary for you to explore the potential for collaborations with folks off your team, because if you were to have a good idea with them, it's unclear who would get the credit for that. And this fear of credit kind of was brought up as a reason why people didn't engage in this exploratory work, right? And so I want to be really clear about what the data are and aren't saying at this point, because I think that one of the easy things to maybe do here would be kind of start pointing fingers. And so what I want to say is this. The data say that it's not that people aren't interdisciplinary, right? We're looking at people's work. People are engaging across disciplinary boundaries. It's not that people don't know how to collaborate. People have these really rich understandings of how you go about doing this type of work. It's also not that people don't want to collaborate, right? People are working at NCSA because they see it as a space where this type of really cool interdisciplinary work happens. It's also not that people purposefully built this siloing structure that happened, right, over time. What the data seem to suggest is that this organizational structure, which is effectively what it is the result of a complex and dynamic emergent process of a series of social, structural things that happened over a period of time. Right? It's a wicked problem in itself. There's no simple answer to why this happened, and that likely means that there's no simple answer for how do you fix it, necessarily. So the question at this point isn't who do we blame, the question is what can we do, and maybe what should we do, right? So and I include the should there because I want us to be mindful of the fact that this structure is doing something, right? And so before we try and change things, we need to be aware of what it is doing. It's allowing these folks to manage their time, to work in very specific places, but what it's not doing is it's not allowing for what you would see at an organizational level, this fostering and transmission of ideas, this potential for innovation at a high level of analysis, okay? So what can we do? I think that one specific thing that we can do today surrounds coming back to this myth. And so remember, so we have this first notion, this frame of interdisciplinarity that's kind of around connection, finding people, building a relationship, being aware of what they're doing. Then we have the second frame that's all about dialogue, developing a deep relationship with someone. And so the really interesting thing, when you hear people talk about collaboration and innovation, is they often really only talk about the connection part when they're talking about anybody but themselves. And we see this within people. So the same respondent will, within the same interview, go from talking about how important it is to build these relationships. When you ask them what an organization should do, they should say, well, they should make people aware of what everybody else is doing, right? So you see that shift? We're shifting from deep engagement to awareness of what's going on around you. And this notion of the role that this connection frame played in actually hindering the ability to address these challenges came up in our interviews, right? At multiple levels of analysis. So what I'm going to do for the next portion of the talk is talk about how taking a connection frame, viewing collaboration as this process of just being aware of what's going around you, hurts your ability to actually build these types of relationships. So one thing that people talked about at the individual level is that if I have this connection mindset, or the person that I'm seeking to develop a relationship with has this connection mindset, it actually hinders our ability to build a relationship. And one of the recurring kind of indicators of this was this notion of a service mindset that people talk about a lot of the time. That if I come to you and seek a relationship, why can't you just give me your knowledge, right? You're an expert in computer science. Why don't you just write some code for me, and then I will use that code and go home, right? This is based in a connective concept of collaboration. So we saw great quotes like this. So usually the biggest challenges come from viewing us as a service and undermining our intellectual stake in the situation. When they view it as a service, that puts a default ceiling on the level of collaboration we can have. It gets to the point where they say, okay, it's time for you guys folks to go home. It's time for the real scientists to take over here, right? And so the model within this form of speech is one where I am viewing the relationship we have as just an exchange of resources, as opposed to the mutual co-production of something together, right? Which goes fundamentally against the work of doing interdisciplinarity, this notion of finding mutual benefit, this notion of understanding each other's perspectives and finding a way to integrate them, right? So this connection mindset is hurting things at the individual level. At the organizational level, it's also hurting things. So one of the things that we heard people talk about over and over again is if you think of the problem of interdisciplinarity as one of connecting multiple disciplines, the answer to that problem is connection. And so we heard people talk about things like, well, what should an organization do? They should implement a knowledge management system. They should have a directory. They should have a monthly report where people report their things. They should have speed dating events. They should have these kind of lightning talks where people talk about their things that they're going to do, right? And what we heard time and time again from people is that these are great. These are great things, but they're also so frustrating. Because if you're in this context where you have this potential to see connection, but you don't have the resources to continue and explore these relationships, these potential relationships that you see in this space, it's like a tease, right? Because you see all this thing, but you can't do anything about it. And so we see people saying like this, it's not just having an inventory, but knowing what people want to do with their knowledge, but you also have to know, do they just want to do their job, or do they actually want to work with others? And then the next level is, if you know who wants to do what, is there an opportunity for you to even do that? There's a lot of restrictions being ignored by just waving your hands. Saying we're going to do this doesn't mean you're actually going to do this, right? And so the argument here is that if we just think of the problem as connection, but we're ignoring that there needs to be the resources to be able to explore these opportunities as we reveal them through our connective processes and organizations. So let's think about this at an even higher level, institutional level. This notion that dialogue is a key component of building these relationships. And remember I told you this is work that is largely invisible, right? We heard time and time again that this was one of the biggest barriers that people faced as they sought to do this, is they didn't get rewarded for actually doing this work. So it's common for administrators to say we need more transdisciplinarity, but the obstacles have been there forever. If you try to do something straddling fields, then you're seen as not really legitimate in either of those fields. The way you get academic credit, that would lead to promotion is to do really well in some field and publishing in the journals of that field, right? So we see here that people perceive that even beyond the organizational level, there are higher level barriers, institutional barriers, that are rewarding this notion of connecting, right, but not engaging across these different spaces, right? So as we move forward, I think it's valuable for us to think about kind of how we can take a more dialogic approach as we seek to build specific interventions designed to do this, right? And think to ourselves, so as we do this. And so our team has developed kind of this strategy, this practice that we've been finding ourselves doing over the year, which is listening as people talk about interdisciplinarity for what frame they have. And so I'm going to close with kind of a charge to you, which is that moving forward, when you hear someone promoting something like interdisciplinarity, collaboration, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, knowledge brokering, right? The thing that you can do today is ask yourself, what is the frame that's being deployed here? Right? And if it's a connective frame, you'll be amazed how common this notion of connection happens, right? When we talk about mosaic, we talk about this object. We talk about this object, this thing that was built. We talk about how it involved these two people, right? We don't talk about the context where it happened. We don't talk about all the hard work and years of work. We don't talk about all the constellation of actors that were involved in making this type of software producible in this space, right? And so by perpetuating this notion of connection, we're really kind of limiting our ability to address the real issue at hand. And so by thinking about this, when you hear someone say this, you can then engage in dialogue with them and say, so how do we do this? Let's thank you. So I left a lot of time for questions because I thought we might have a discussion.
I hope there are lots of questions.
Farzana.
Thanks, Will, for this is very good talk. I appreciate it. My job is put together interdisciplinary research together and bring people together from unlikely places. One of the challenges I see in people participating in this interdisciplinary research and projects are they think they are losing their identity because now they have to come into a group that they don't know what their role is and they are not clear, but in their lifetime they have reached this achievement, this expertise, and they want to put that on a table right off the bat. So I find that communication plays a huge, huge role as somebody who's coordinating it to allocate this job, to make sure that they are actually solving a bigger problem by less work. It's kind of challenging, so I was wondering if you have any comment about that.
I mean, I think this is something that we see a lot, right? Is this notion that it takes humility, you know, to engage in this sort of work, recognizing that people may not see you as the bigwig that you may be in your local space, right? And it's really, the answer to it is kind of revealing the potential right? Understanding that if I am capable of building this kind of common language with you, we may be able to accomplish something together, right? One of the things I didn't really talk about here is that some people don't really want to do this. And that's, I think, okay. And I think it's something that we should kind of figure out how to address at a micro and macro level, right? One of the reasons that I didn't talk about the rest of that distribution in that graph is because it's unclear what is the optimal level of interdisciplinarity in one's network, right? This is a question that we can't answer with these data, right? And so we need some people who remain within boundaries as well as those who bridge between them. But you can't really ask that question without thinking about kind of the difference between dialogue and connection. Right? So, does that help?
Thanks. I just wanted to make sure I was clear. When you presented the data on the networks that people had and what is being evaluated for interdisciplinary work and connectiveness, that's all internal to NCSA. It doesn't account for interdisciplinary work that people may be doing across their community or things. Is that true?
These are all folks who are internal to NCSA, but the alters that they're listing can be outside of NCSA. And so the measure of withinness is just within the formal organizational chart of the organization. So if you have 100%, you're only talking to people who are within your formal organizational membership of whatever you're listed in as being in the organizational chart of the organization.
Have you tried to make a spider diagram where you have the nodes and connections and see who's the most important?
Absolutely.
And what does that look like? I suppose you don't have one to show us.
So we're being very mindful in not showing an overlaid graph in these data. A full graph, a network graph of the full overlaid network. One of the challenges with particularly survey approaches to network analysis is that network data at a global level are very sensitive to missing data. Okay, and so we had 53% of the organization respond to our survey, which is pretty good from a survey perspective, but this means that not only do we have 47% of the nodes potentially missing from our data, but you think about all the exponential increase in potential missing connections between nodes that we have, right? And so this is why we're taking what's called an egocentric approach to these analysis. We're looking specifically at individuals' networks, right? But yes, I mean, I think it would be really interesting to think about what roles are people playing in the organization as a whole, right? You look like... Yes?
All what NCSA might look like?
I think it looks like the graph that I showed you, right? I think it looks like a cluster of loosely connected but highly internally connected silos is what that analysis suggests the higher level network is. Now, we do have qualitative data that suggests that certain individuals within the organization play brokering roles, right? And so one way, if we could think about kind of managing innovation at a higher level, is thinking about what's the balance between people who are siloed that work within their teams, as well as having folks who bridge teams between them. What is the balance between those that we need to kind of foster an increase in this exchange of ideas between these siloed groups, right? And there's actually literature in innovation that suggests that clustered networks are actually very good. They're not as good for finding new combinations of ideas, but they're actually very good for implementing those ideas, right? And so if you read that literature well, again, what we don't want is a completely connected graph. What we want is a graph that is connected enough to foster the movement of information when it needs to, but with these tightly clusters of expertise that can actually make things happen, right? So, yeah.
I had a question on a different angle. I was struck by one of the comments in that you cited about a person afraid that he would be giving away his value, the cookie story. Mm-hmm. And in business or software, I think you don't start a business unless you're prepared to give away 98% of the value in your lawyer and your, you need to be able to be involved in something that's going to create so much credit you're satisfied with a fair share of it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Does that say anything about the scale of projects that we're engaged in? I mean, is that kind of like low intellectual value that if you collaborate, there's still not enough of a share for each person in the collaboration?
I think it's more So I think it's a really good point, right? This notion, why are people afraid to give away their value when we live in this enterprise that should be...
Well, it's a question of what we let in the door.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. I think that what's driving this fear a lot of the time is actually the uncertainty of whether or not these things would actually get implemented in the first place, right? So if I'm depending upon this soft grant funding and I'm using my time that is not being accounted for, time is very closely accounted for within this organization, right? So if I'm spending 10% of my time exploring, right, where do I bill that, right? Oftentimes, I'm not billing that to anybody if I'm doing it, right? And so it's not only, well, maybe you're going to get the credit for this, maybe this is going to be something that evolves into something that's really more applicable in your wheelhouse, right? But how do I, maybe it's not even going to be something that's going to be useful for me down the line as well, right? But yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of uncertainty and kind of putting yourself out there that creates this kind of fear associated with resources.
Did you quantify right here?
Sorry. Yeah.
I will. Excellent talk. There was a push really for a lot of teams to write proposals with external academic institutions.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you have a delineation between, is a particular group, they might have so much communication with other groups at NCSA, but they might have a lot of external communication to other academic institutions. And then secondarily, another comment, I thought it might be an interesting exercise to try to create a communication diagram of what NCSA looks like, and I guess that you're building that with a certain amount of people here at the center that you've interviewed, but
that's right.
To try to create a comprehensive one would be an interesting graph.
It would be, and I think this gets back to the question over here: is that we just don't have the density of data to build that diagram and have it be meaningful, right? Because if I just overlaid these 134 nodes, we could look at who was brokering and look at where the things were, right? But we'd really risk the influence of there actually being a whole group of people who aren't represented in our survey who are actually playing and bridging kind of these different groups, right? But I think, what we were hoping for when we sent out the survey was that we would get enough data that we could do that. Because I think that would be totally a fascinating analysis to do. The first question about inside and outside of the organization, it's not a way we've cut the data at this point. It's something we could potentially do and say, how many connections do you have with people that aren't just not on your team, but within NCSA, but outside of NCSA, and looking at that as another measure of silentness, right? So we're just touching the surface of what we want to do with these data at this point. We've only had them for a couple months, and so we really only have had the ability to cook them a little bit to share with you for the day. But yeah, lots of exciting things. Yes, yeah.
So I was interested if you have any idea on how the diversity of students and postdocs and faculty, as we have a strategy at the moment to engage more with the campus, so have many more campus researchers in the building, how that might affect the statistics. Also, if there's any intervention that would be interesting to try out over the next year and then come back and see how the numbers change. I wonder if there's any experiment that would be interesting, that would be in line of things we might be interested to do as well.
Absolutely.
that you might hypothesize would increase the connectiveness between these different silos.
Sure. So first question first. So what role do grad students, postdocs, bringing fellows from the rest of the university play in this? A couple of really interesting studies looking at kind of the role that students and graduate students play in the exchange of knowledge in multidisciplinary grants. And some of it suggests that they play a very important brokering role, right? Because oftentimes it are these folks who are doing the day-to-day work and actually negotiating the translation of the science that's going on within them. So if you buy that argument, which I think is reasonable, it would make sense that bringing in more folks like that into this space and having them here is useful. There's also a really interesting set of studies looking at space and interaction, right? The famous being Thomas Allen studies of R&D shops in the 70s, the 30-meter rule, maybe you guys have heard of. This notion that your propensity for even talking to someone drops off exponentially as they become physically 30 meters away from you inside your workspace in the organization. This is a robust finding, right? And so being there is a big deal. And this is something that came up in our discussions as well, right? This notion of where are the people in the halls? Where's the coffee shop? Where's, one of my favorite spaces in the building is this open space right here, which on most times of day is actually quite empty, right? And the intention of this space, if from a design perspective, at least my thought is, a space for people to congregate, right? And so this, to me, demonstrates how this isn't just a resource issue. There's multiple levels of barriers in place, right? Cultural, structural things that are going on here. It's not a simple fix. Yeah.
You'll notice there are many spaces in the building that have the name interaction space, which are quite empty.
Yeah.
But if you want a case study to start looking at right now, I've heard that the culture at ECE has changed in their new building.
Okay.
This is hearsay. But everybody had to go to the mail room and was clustered in that claustrophobic corner of the first floor. People saw each other a lot. And now they're complaining they're all off in their labs and the building and the culture.
Yeah. But remember, we're slipping into a connection mindset here, right? So we get people in the space, that's great. Maybe they're talking to each other. But we need to address this issue of fostering them to continue dialogue, which gets me, I have to answer the second half of Gab's question, which is an intervention that is interesting to me, right? And it's actually one that the administration has been talking about that I think is particularly interesting, is this notion of free energy money, right? This idea that we're going to, and I don't know the mechanics of it, and I don't know how they'll be implemented, but this idea that we will find some source of resources to make available across the board for not only exploring, but seeding potential ideas. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, Ed. I'm actually curious about kind of what the ideas are for that. But yeah, that's interesting to me as a mechanism to support dialogue, right? Yeah. Yes. This guy back here has had his hand up forever.
I had the mic next.
Sorry, Barbara.
And I'm looking at the clock and realizing I'm supposed to be running out the door to introduce the speaker in another seminar.
Okay.
So I just love what you've done well. I think you really hit the nail on the head from my 20 years at NCSA. I do think we need a little reality check, though, about what it was like when the core funding was here, because when I first started, it was here.
Yeah.
And even at that time, I was a new faculty member trying to get people excited. Wouldn't you like to help me and work with me on this? And no, we're really busy out working with this group or that group, and just couldn't get them to engage because they were already busy doing a lot of things.
Absolutely.
So even though there was core funding, I think we still had silos at that time, but maybe they're larger silos now. And then thinking about how, like, this dialogue idea, I go to the coffee pot and we're talking, oh yeah, how's the weather? The conversations, there isn't a structure to get beyond those sort of superficial, but yet sometimes it's happened, and I've had career-changing conversations that just randomly happen out on the sidewalk and never would have happened without NCSA. So having some kind of structure to support deeper dialogues, it's the intellectual engagement that really gets people. What's the things that are exciting you right now? And wow, that's exciting me too. Maybe we could talk, maybe we could do something interesting. And having enough free space to make that happen, I think, is important. So my question, I guess, is whether people have studied other organizations that have been successful or more successful at this process. My father worked at Bell Labs back in the 60s, and an incredible place of inventions and creativity that came out of it. I have no idea whether it had silos or not. Do you know?
So there are a number of studies looking at places. The one that's jumping to mind is actually Andrew Hargadon's work on Thomas Edison's labs, but he's also done some really interesting research looking at design firms like IDEO. We did a case study of IDEO. And a lot of these themes come up in this space. They have an open office, but they also have this culture of putting away your badge, right? And constantly exploring and being ready to fail, right? Which is something we didn't really talk about, is that this process of invention involves a lot of failure over time, right? And so you need to have the ability to fail and not a fear of failing. As well. The one little thing I'll say, there's a great literature on organizational culture that says that stories are a really great way to see culture, right? And so what's interesting to me less about these stories of the time before is whether or not they're accurately portraying the difference between then and now, but that they're a really good lens for us to understand people's perceptions of what's going on in this space. So yes, now the hand in the back. Yes.
I'm just curious, this is great data that you've gathered. Do you have anything similar, or could you help us, I guess, put this in context in terms of how it might compare to other UIUC institutes or other HPC centers or companies? What's the sort of frame of reference we should be thinking about?
Yeah, so I can't tell you the extent to which quantitatively this is different. I can compare it to other contexts where I've done research, right? One of the other projects I did was a year-long study of the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which is a big interdisciplinary scientific context. And there was quite a bit of siloing there as well. So my hunch is that, and a lot of these similar issues came up in conversations, right? So my hunch is that this is not necessarily a localized problem to this particular space, right? This is why in that slide I was trying to say it's not anybody's fault necessarily. I think that this is a bigger systemic issue.
Not even a judgment specific.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's just what I'm trying to do with this work is reveal the nature of the context so that we can start to address it. Right? If we really buy this notion that transdisciplinary is important, we need to understand the context before we can develop kind of these strategies to do it. Yeah, Kevin.
Thanks a lot, Will. There's one conclusion one could make from this presentation, which is that if you want to have a more dialogue-focused culture rather than a connection-focused culture, you need to have less accountability.
Interesting. Yep.
That's one narrative one can come at from this, and that is where accountability came up in the quote about I got to write a report. Yep. It's all external funding driven, and that resonates with some people's description of an even earlier moment, the pre-Mansfield Amendment moment of federally funded university research, when everything could happen in this sort of blue sky way. And it seems to me if we see accountability as a barrier to dialogue-based interaction, we're sunk. So we got to mediate that some way. So I just wonder if you could help contextualize that as a potential conclusion from this initial stage of research.
That's a great question, Kevin. And I don't have a great answer for it, I'm sorry. But I do think that this notion of slack resources is something that we talk about a lot as being important to innovation in organizations, right? And you don't have to give away all of kind of the accountability with the bathwater. And we can do certain things like start rewarding people, right? Making them accountable for playing this type of role, right? So we could develop potentially one of the institutional level things that we could talk about, knowing that dialogue is important, that there is this invisible work, is how do we, and I don't have an answer to it, but how do we gauge whether someone is doing this well, you know? And one thing I should mention is that we have no performance data in this entire study. And the reason that was very intentional, because I really didn't want this to be seen as a judgment. I really wanted to just kind of understand the context as a whole. But I think it brings up all sorts of questions about kind of, okay, so how do we build a place where you can perform well in this space moving forward? Yeah.
I'll add one comment to that. Just we have had a long dialogue with some people, for example, Kelvin Drogemeyer, who was here recently, who was the vice chair of the National Science Board and a graduate of the U of I, about exactly this issue and what's happening, say, at the National Science Foundation, that even the National Science Board that oversees the foundation is concerned about, which is along the issue of so much accountability that's being driven largely by the federal government processes into the NSF that then it filters down rather rapidly into the science communities, and how that is stifling innovation. So there's real concern about this at the very highest levels. And so, but of course, you have to have accountability, so you can't throw it out, but we have to find a way to manage that in a better way, I think. And there's concern everywhere for this.
Absolutely.
So not really a question, but also wanted to say really interesting research, and the presentation was really engaging and fascinating. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
You did a really great job. I really liked the quotes that you gave, and I know that it's kind of got to be anonymous, but I don't know if there's a way that we could make those available for people to read, because I feel like I really connected with the study when I read those.
So one of the things that our participants agreed with, and one of the things that I should point out about these quotes, is that they're indicative of broader level strategies in the data. Right? And so these slides will be, we can probably make them available, right, somehow. We're happy to share that.
And then I just want to say, I hope that this isn't the end of your research with us, and that there's an opportunity to keep moving forward. It's been very, very interesting.
Well, that's very nice to hear, and it's certainly something that I'm very much interested in doing. So exploring those opportunities.
Well, on that one, I'd like to just comment. I really want to keep this going as well. I think This is one of the challenges of our age, actually, not just for NCSA nor for the university here, but just as a global problem. We have to find ways to address these issues that you're uncovering if we're going to live up to the promise of what I think people see as the 21st century trends in science and engineering and research generally. All these National Academy reports, they don't come out of thin air. They're actually reflecting trends that are going on, and we need to find a way here. And I'd like to see us as a leader in thinking through how we address these issues and then implement them at NCSA and with our colleagues across the campus. So we'll keep going. Another thing is we should think about maybe an event where we have a kind of a retreat or some kind of an event where we have people discussing these issues, and maybe you could help us, design such an event that would allow us to get at the heart of some of these things going forward.
Yeah.
Are there any last questions or comments? I didn't want to stop the comments with what sounded like a final comment.
Right.
Okay.
Well, let's
thank Will again. Thanks so much.
Yeah.